Good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's Story Survive program with Dr. Janine Holc. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. So thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. So you can learn more about that and buy tickets on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box. So not the chat, but the Q&A. It just helps us keep track of them a little bit easier. And we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the hour. So today we are so honored to be joined by Dr. Janine Holc. Dr. Holc is professor of political science at Loyola University, Maryland. She has published on democratic institutions in Poland, reproductive rights in Eastern Europe, the politics of Holocaust memory, and anti-Semitism. Her most recent book is The Weavers of Tratenau, Jewish Female Forced Labor in the Holocaust, published by Brandeis University Press in 2023. And you can purchase The Weavers of Tratenau at the link in the chat, and I will put that link in again in just a moment. So thank you so much for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Holc.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm going to share my screen here, my PowerPoint. And thank you to the museum for the wonderful series and for hosting me. Appreciate it. Thank you to the audience for listening and tuning in. I'd like to begin with an image. This is a photo of two Jewish girls in Bożekowo, Poland, a very small town near Kielce, taken in 1937, 2 years before the German army would invade to begin World War II. The girl on the right is Zosia Puderschnitt, who was 11 at the time of the picture, and who would be put into forced labor in 1941 when she was 15 in a textile factory in the Sudetenland in the city called Trautenau at that time, its German name, today called Trutnov, its Czech name. Zosia carried this photo with her, sometimes in her shoe, sometimes hidden elsewhere, throughout her entire forced labor experience from 1941 through May 1945, and she donated it, along with a couple others, to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum after the war. In this photo, Zosia and her cousin expressed their friendship, closeness, and solidarity. Two girls sitting solidly at the base of a big, strong tree, looking at the camera with confidence, although Zosia is a bit more open in her expression than her cousin. They seem to have agreed on a shared posture, mirroring each other, joined in their symmetry by a firm grip of the hands. I chose this photo to introduce my topic, the ways in which the Jewish girls and women trapped in labor camps during the Holocaust imagine their futures. Because although Zosia and her cousin have not yet, at the time of this photo, experienced the occupation and war, the separations and deaths, they hold us in their gaze here as Jewish girls who, among other things, have a future and have an awareness of friendship, family, and relationships as crucial to that future. My question in writing this book about a cluster of forced labor camps in Trautenau and how the young women in them is to some extent, what happened to this posture? What happened to this gaze? How did it change, and how was it expressed under the dire conditions of the Nazi project of the Shoah and the local exploitation of Jewish girls and women as slave laborers? How did these girls ward off despair, and how did they survive? It seems that Zosia herself found this photo important to her survival, and that it was one of the very few she risked taking with her to the camp, Oberaltstadt in the Trautenau region, and that she thought important enough to be donated to the Holocaust Museum's archives. Zosia Puderschnitt was, of course, not the only 15-year-old forced into labor in the early 1940s during the German occupation. Sosha's family lived in Dąbrowa Górnicza, a small town in the Zagłębie region of Poland in what the Nazi regime called East Upper Silesia. Zagłębie was west of Krakow and represented here by this blue circle there on the map, and was anchored by Sosnowiec, a larger city that was about 1/4 Jewish, mostly Polish, a few Germans, and mixed German-Polish families. I'll mention a few other towns that were around Sosnowiec because some in the audience might be familiar with them: Będzin, Olkusz, Krzanów, and many, many others. Just over the border from Germany, as you can see, it was immediately occupied the very first week in September 1939, and the Jewish communities in Zagłębie endured random street violence, arrests, harassment, murders in the first days, and then were immediately stripped of their citizenship, of course, and their assets, as Jews were in the German Reich. However, Zagłębie was not made part of the general government like the rest of Poland. It was annexed as a special territory to Germany, in the main because of its economic vibrancy. It was a center of manufacturing, a center of trade in all directions, and agriculture and mining was nearby. Himmler constructed Zagłębie as East Upper Silesia, and he made it a source of labor, Jewish labor, but also Polish labor, for the many, many factories and initiatives in the area. He appointed Albrecht Schmelt as the administrator, and some in the audience may have heard of the Schmelt organization. What made this little area very different from the rest of occupied Eastern Europe was that Jewish families could live in their homes. Although their mobility was restricted on some streets and by a curfew, they could conduct their private lives as they wished, such as getting married, etc., although schools and synagogues were shut down or physically destroyed. This system, which included a Jewish council to which everyone had to register, allowed Schmelt and the SS to recruit Jews for labor very flexibly. Every family had to surrender someone for labor already in 1940, maybe for a day, for a month, for a year. At first, it was just one person in the family, and then more and more until everyone was a potential source for deportation to a labor camp. Summer of 1942 was the first time that the authorities created a ghetto and deported groups of Sosnowiec and Zagłębie Jews to Auschwitz, and then again in the summer of 1943. In this system, Zosia Puderschnitt and hundreds of girls and young unmarried women were assigned to a cluster of textile factories. And here comes the Tratenau that is in the title of the book and that I mentioned, in that's in the red there on the map. They were assigned to a cluster of these factories, separated from their families, forced to live in crowded barracks with very little food and no medical care. They worked alongside civilian Czech and German women in dangerous conditions, and they were sometimes transferred, but in the main remained in this region in forced labor until they were liberated in May 1945. And the ages we're talking about are from about 12 all the way to the early 20s. Now, the Schmelt organization was supposed to only take people age 15, but you know they didn't follow that rule particularly strictly. Now, this is a big change of a slide here. This is from the Holocaust Memorial Museum's encyclopedia. This is the same region, if you can believe it, in 1944 already, in which all of these small textile and other types of factories, armament factories, were popped up in this region. They became officially concentration camps instead of Arbeitslager, and they became officially part of the Gross Rosen camp system. The camp that Zosia was sent to and that many from Zagłębie endured was part of a group that I focused on in the book, and I'm going to list them in case some people might have had family members in these camps. Oberaltstadt, and I also circled them here on this map. I focused in on Oberaltstadt, Parschnitz, Gabersdorf, Bernsdorf, and Schatzler. These work sites were all female with female guards, and as I noted, the female Gentile co-workers, they were small. I'm talking initially about maybe 300 to 500 in each, although that grew over time. And it went through all the way from 1940 all the way to 1945. Not everyone came in 1940. People came in waves, right, as they were requested by the factories. These girls worked in the belief that they were helping their families back in Zagwembe survive, but the brutality of the conditions, as we'll talk about in a minute, were inescapable. However, most did survive, and many gave testimony in a courageous act, gave testimony to the Shoah Foundation's Video History Archive. And it was these taped testimonies that I used as a basis for the book to reconstruct their experience. In the testimonies, there are many accounts of moments of despair, often deep despair, in particular at being separated from their families. What struck me, however, was the evidence here and there of that gaze of Zosia's, that direct gaze holding some kind of potentiality in opposition to the Nazi regime's goal of ending any concept of a Jewish future. I'd like to offer now two instances where that concept of the future, or what I call futurity, emerged in the testimonies of the Tratenau textile laborers. And the first comes from the testimony here of Rose Leichter. She was born Róża Remechowska in Sosnowiec in 1926, and she was sent to work in Bernsdorf, one of these small factories. Rose begins her anecdote by referring to the Gentile community that lived in the surrounding area of the camps. So these camps they had been factories from before the war started. They were part of a town. They were part of a local economy. People lived near them. People worked near them. And the forced laborers were simply put into improvised barracks, often made not like a factory building right next to the factory, sometimes not. So she begins by referring to the Gentile community in the surrounding area, and she notes the name of one of her campmates, Mala Sternberg. She says, one young Czech, and I have it here in the next slide, one young Czech I remember who passed by around the outside of our living quarters, the wiring, and he looked like Perry Como, and he threw over a note which was a love letter. Here Rose seems to know something more than she's saying about this act. Maybe he had thrown over a letter before or had spoken with Mala at the fence, but Rose knew it was a love letter. And then she says, he loved Mala dearly. So clearly this kind of romance between the Gentile Czech male walking past and Mala had been going on for some time. Rose then adds, but he couldn't go near her. He was not allowed to. So he risked his life to pass by and threw over the wires a letter. Obviously, Mala, I could not understand because the SS guard Marta was right there. Mala was so eager to pick it up, and she ran over and picked it up. Here, Rose has laid out a scene for us, the viewers and the interviewer. We imagine a fenced-in area, Mala and the other Jewish girls and young women, an SS guard, all present, all watching a letter fly over the fence. What would it take for paper to float over a barbed wire fence? Well, I'm guessing it was probably tied to a stone or maybe even an apple. And the letter lands and everyone just looks at it. They all seem to know, I'm interpreting from how Rose put it, that it is for Mala. And the guard, of course, sees it too, as Rose says. Right in front of the guard, Mala goes over. In fact, she runs over to pick it up. Rose continues. And the punishment she got for picking up that note was to kneel on her knees for 24 hours an iron, heavy, long stick. I remember how she was sitting like that. And here in the video, Rose holds out her arms in front of her, with her hands out on her knees and an iron across. When she couldn't kneel anymore, she would fall down, and Marta the guard would come over and whip her and make her stand up. And this was her punishment. And she shaved her head and made a big cross on top of her head. Mala, she had hair like an angel, just long blonde hair, and her body was like, I would say, Marilyn Monroe, sculpture, just a beautiful looking girl. And that's what happened to her, the punishment. After the punishment, 24 hours was done, she went into the living quarters. Here Rose almost says house, on her bunk bed, and she cried and cried and cried. The way she looked and the way she felt and talked, exhausted. And then a German lady, Frau Miller, came over and she said to her, "Don't cry, my dear. You be happy that you're alive. She could have sent you away to Auschwitz. You never be here again." Samal stopped crying and realized what she said to her. She said to her, "Hair grows back, but a life, when you get killed, you're never going to come back on this earth. So be brave and go on working." Now, this incident, we can interpret this incident in a number of ways. And as a historian, we could interpret it as simply one person giving another person a forbidden letter and the punishment that followed. We could use this anecdote to document the brutality of the Nazi regime, how even female guards treated female prisoners, the tools the female guards used to humiliate women by focusing on their hair in particular. But Rose stresses Mala's beauty and her physicality, as well as Mala's eagerness to pick up the letter. Rose herself remembers this incident. It takes up quite a bit of time in her testimony. She remembers it in great detail. And we could say she positions both Mala and her lover as objects of desire, Perry Como and Marilyn Monroe. They stand in for the beauty, desire, and intimacy that Rose remembers being familiar with herself at that time, and she even remembers Mala's body. Mala's actions through Rose's story and Rose's narration can also be seen in another way, I would argue, as an impulse towards a future different from the one dictated by the Nazis for Jews, different from what even seemed possible at the time. How could Mala think she could pick up a letter in front of that guard? Did she think she would not be punished? We don't know, but it seems as if the potential of a reality in which Mala was the recipient of romantic love and could act on that love was very much present, and also was something that those who witnessed it, Rose and others, could see, interpret, and empathize with. Although Rose spends time detailing the punishment and Mala's weeping, she never says Mala should not have picked up the letter. And indeed, in other incidents that we've heard of, those of us who study the Holocaust and read about the Holocaust know there are small incidents like this that happen all the time from survivors. There's always a brutal punishment, right? But it coexists with a commitment to an act that presumes a very different present and a very different future. The incident that Rose Leichter recalls in her testimony can be productively compared to a different incident that I'd like to share now, in which the Jewish girls and women, this time of Parshnitz, so Rose is in Bernsdorf, this is in Parshnitz, another barracks about 5 miles away, worked through, and here they worked through what might be called a powerful presence of a Jewish future. This incident was spoken of not by one person, but by over 30 testimony givers from Parshnitz separately in their testimony, and had a very big impact on them. And I will present just a few of those testimony givers here. And I'm going to begin with Rose Sontag, born in 1927 in one of the towns in Zagwembe. And in this incident, all of the young women together collectively witness a death march of Jewish men in early 1945. Death marches, which the audience may know, were forced marches of prisoners from a range of sites of detention. Auschwitz and Gross Rosen, but also many, many smaller subcamps. If we recall that map of Gross Rosen, just there were so many sites in which Nazis detained prisoners and held them. And in 1945, there was an order given that these camps had to be evacuated towards Germany westward. And these death marches were mostly on foot, and their aim was to avoid capture of the prisoners by the Allies or by partisan groups. Most of the historical documentation and mapping of these marches focus on the very large camps like Auschwitz. But throughout early 1945, there were constant forced movements of prisoners as, for example, factories stopped production, right? So what were they going to do with all of their forced laborers? Sometimes they were transferred. Sometimes there was some aerial bombardment in the area, so the SS and the civilian staff sought to avoid it, and so they moved people. Or sometimes camps just collapsed and stopped functioning because of disease or other reasons. And in fact, there were so many of these marches that sometimes they just crossed paths, they were going in opposite directions. And they were especially prevalent in the Sudetenland as the Soviet army approached from the east and the other allies, the US, British, approached from the west. Now, the girls and women in the cluster of camps, you may remember I said were not liberated until May 1945. So in January, we see the beginning of the death marches, but there is no death march for the girls and women in these particular camps, and they stay there. They continue to be put to work, digging trenches and other kinds of manual labor. So however, the girls and women in the concentration camps in the Tratenau region did not really know about death marches. They had heard rumors about Auschwitz, but they had no idea of the extent of malnutrition, starvation, beatings, humiliation that Jewish prisoners in larger camps had been going through. I'm going to read how they first realized this death march was coming, which they did not know initially was a death march. So Rose S. says, "We heard, like in the evening at night when we came from work, we heard that they are bringing men, that men are coming, marching in. And they were chasing them like cattle back into the yard from our camp. And we looked and we said, men. We saw they had the star, so from other camps. So everybody was looking through the window and wanted to see if there were some relatives or something." And that was the initial kind of response. And here Rose remembers the immediate sensation of hearing that Jewish men would be present in their camps. And it was, of course, about seeing relatives, wanting news, people who might know where a brother, a father was. But it was also at the same time, in what Rose is saying and how she's presenting, and also in some of the other things I'll read, it was also about Jewish men as a collective, Jewish men as a presence, as a sign of Jewish survival and a sign of the Jewish communities of pre-war Europe. So here's some of the other testimony givers that I will be reading from. Anna Weiss. "I've never seen anything like it in my life. It was a sea of marching people in those uniforms, the striped uniforms. It was a sea." Rosalie Steinweiss. "One transport stopped at our camp overnight, and we weren't allowed to go to the window to look." Estelle. "They came, and we see so many Jewish people, so everybody was anxious to see if it's anybody that's a relative, but they forbidded us." Freimita. "Before the war was going to finish, they brought a transport of men to our lager. And then everybody was, oh, maybe a father came, maybe a brother. Let me go look." Shoshana G. "There was a transport of men, and they put them in one room. They couldn't sit, they couldn't stand, they couldn't lie down. It was no space." Lucy Matzner. "Also, there were men transported. They were on a death march. They had some 5,000 men, and we had to draw the shades because we were not allowed to look down. Otherwise, they would shoot. The girls were looking anyway." And Phyllis Young, and here in speaking, I want to say Phyllis loses her composure and begins to cry. She's giving testimony as you can see, as older adults. "I have never seen, we look next to them like we just got back from a resort or something. When we saw them, they were emaciated. They couldn't walk. These fragments of testimony that I assembled together express the complexity of emotions incited by this sea of Jewish men suddenly appearing, combined with the command not to look. In these words, as they're spoken, looking itself becomes laden with assertion and even yearning. Lucy M's looking anyways can refer to either taking in the number of men or the search for a specific person. We don't know which. This glimpse, if they could get it, would tell them Jews still lived, Jewishness still existed, a future family was possible for them, and maybe even their own families still lived. I'll add a few more here. Gucha. At night, we saw them through the windows, and it was no windows. It was like a factory with little windows, and we could look out. We were not allowed to go out, but we saw men. And the interviewer asked, "Did you know they were Jewish men?" And Gucha says, "Yes, we were calling out to them, and they were calling back. We didn't know their names. We didn't know who they were, and we didn't know where they were going, and they themselves did not know where they were going." Anna Weiss again. We were told not to look out the windows, and I was a little bit more curious, so I went to one hall, which I thought nobody was there, and I looked. And then Phyllis again, Phyllis Young. It was the first time I saw a Jewish man since 1941, and they came into our camp. The men were housed overnight on a floor below where the girls were staying. The testimony givers are amazed at the possibility of men even being alive, meaning possibly family members are alive, but they're amazed, but allow themselves to only gradually admit to the condition the men were in. Only a couple mention how emaciated they are, and they remember as adults desperately wanting to look, but at the same time remembering they would be punished for looking. The second part of what happened is that because there were some barracks on a top floor, and then below them was where the men were housed. The girls and young women found a crack in the floor, so there was a water pipe that went through, as there are in these factories, and then there was a circle, right, and there was a little gap. So the testimonies repeat the negotiation between the forbidden looking and then secretly looking through this gap in the structure of the barracks. And Ida G says, at night we stole down and we went down the stairs, and it was a factory, and it had pipes going from top to bottom, and in between the pipes was a place you could look down. The girls and women did not only look, however, they hoped desperately for some kind of interaction with the mass of men, and they wanted a response. And to elicit such a response, they dropped notes. They dropped notes and pieces of bread through the pipe gaps. What were they hoping for? Well, in the testimonies, so many hopes, right? To get news of male relatives, to document themselves in their own names with a Jewish audience, to provide comfort, and to receive recognition, comfort, and some kind of connection in return. And of course, as I said earlier, they'd been isolated from exactly what condition these men must have been in. And the events that unfolded shocked them. So we have Regina G. They brought in a transport of men and they screamed, "Girls, we are so hungry. Please give us something." So we fasted this day and we threw down our piece of bread that we got. Shoshana G. We tried everybody to give a piece of bread. Ida G. We decided to take together what bread we have and throw it down. Ida G. remembers that the girls and women had expected that the men would do what the girls and women do when they shockingly by surprise get an extra piece of bread, which is share it amongst each other. But the behavior of the men was utterly shocking to them. The prisoners clawed for the bread almost without awareness, animal-like, snatching it out of the hands of others. Shoshana G. says, and we all gave a big plate, all the girls gave, to go down to the men, and guess what? They were fighting like animals. We couldn't do this. It was unbearable. To understand that, like animals, they became animals. They were so hungry, they were killing each other. We couldn't do it anymore. And Phyllis Young, the prisoners were killing each other to catch a piece of the bread that we were throwing down. So this incident demonstrates the complexity of the position of the girls and women. They're eager, just as Mala Sternberg was so eager to register somehow the presence of these men in particular. But as Phyllis Wise said, also meant Jewish men in general. They had not seen any Jewish men for years, and they wanted to look, to speak, and to gesture to them, to give them notes, to feed them, to connect with them, to see and be seen. And of course, the priority was to know about brothers and fathers. But the men also represent a component of Jewish social life that the girls and women in Parshutz had been cut off from, a component that would make sense for any Jewish future going forward. And so by future here, I don't mean a simple statement, I want a husband and to have children, although that of course existed, but also a fuller understanding of a continuity in Jewish social life and in Jewish history that includes making a family, but includes all kinds of interactions and possibilities. The disappointment, the disillusionment, the de-idealization is palpable in the words of the testimony givers. As Shoshona G. Greenbaum says, we couldn't do this. It was unbearable. And their efforts at feeding the men were actually causing the men to harm each other, to dehumanize them even further. And she says they became like animals. So to conclude, in this presentation, as in the book, I hope to present a complex picture of how desire and hope functioned alongside despair and disillusionment without contrasting one against the other, hope versus despair. It was not a question of, do you have hope and thus survive? But it was rather, how does the space for the future function while the Nazi aim of preventing any Jewish future is dominant? So it is not a story of redemption or triumph, but really the complexity of how people react to persecution, especially people with a consciousness of their history and their role in history. And most importantly, these people with this consciousness in this case are women, Jewish women, and their sense of the potential open to them is something they create as women with the ingredients available to them in an already gendered world. It's when we listen to these women on their terms as knowledge creators and witnesses that we can hear the possibilities they created for themselves, imagined, pursued, in spite of pain and punishment. Never actualized, they were not able to connect with these men, but they still did it. It was nourishing nonetheless. And I'd like to just say, as a kind of a coda, back to Mala Sternberg, she did not give testimony. She's not in the archives. She's not in the Shoah VHA archives as a testimony giver, although she appears in the International Tracing Service as a person who did survive and spent time in a DP camp in Frankfurt. So while it seems she did not create a life after the war with her Czech Perry Como, there are documents supporting the marriage of at least 4 Jewish survivors of Porschnitz, 2 Czech men, Gentiles, who resided in Tratenau. So in one sense, it can be said that these women maybe didn't contribute to a rebuilding of a specifically Jewish post-war life, since they married Gentiles, in the sense of recuperating the specific ties and lifeways of pre-war Poland. But their choices are perhaps evidence that some love letters thrown over a fence somewhere did lead to lasting connection, that imagining a future is not an act of escapism or naivete, but a crucial practice for refusing dehumanization and despair. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Janine. That was really beautiful and really meaningful to hear about these women. So I appreciate you sharing with us. And for those of you who are watching, feel free to continue sending in questions. So we will move on to audience questions. But I do want to start by asking, when you were talking about how, I apologize, I forget her name, but she said that, he looked like Perry Como, strikes me as such a kind of teenager thing to say, which I think is for some of us it seems anachronistic in this kind of environment. So I'm wondering, like, do you see any of these kind of teenage things in other women's testimony? And also were these women and girls able to maintain some marks of sort of being a teenager while in this environment?
Yes, they definitely did. They weren't, they had cliques. They did all kinds of petty things to each other. Even though they were very short on food, they did have enough food that they didn't starve to death. So they were all able, they worked until 6 p.m. and then they walked home, and they had the evenings were largely unguarded and Sundays were largely unguarded. So they had time to interact socially. There was one anecdote in which very young an adult testimony giver remembers that she was there when she was very young, and the older girls were bragging. They were probably lying, but they were bragging that they weren't virgins anymore. And she said, me neither. I'm not, and she was laughing at herself at the time, wanting to be included in this group. And so there was a lot of, it was very boring. And so there was a lot of talk, all kinds of talk that they wouldn't probably have said if they were back in their towns amongst their communities. Another thing that marked their teenageness was they were willing to take risks. When we think about women in the Holocaust, a lot of the times these are women who have children or elderly extended family, and they have to be concerned with both their survival, but also the survival of others, and it puts them in a very difficult position. These are unmarried women who, of course, care a lot about the survival of their family back home, but they believe that their family is surviving back home. And so they do all kinds of things. They break into like the storeroom and steal food. They sneak out. They do all kinds of things. They don't try to escape because they think that would harm their families. So it was really a sadistic kind of impression that the forced labor project gave them, that, keep working so for your families. So they took all kinds of risks that I talk about in the book, that, another type of, so I think it's a gendered perspective, but it's also a perspective based on age.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is so interesting to see people of different ages and how they reacted to the Holocaust. But you did mention in your answer that these girls were being told that they were working, to kind of save their families in a way, or keep their families safe. So I'm wondering if by the time that the men kind of showed up on when they were on the death march, what was that kind of illusion broken for these girls, or did they still believe at that point that there was some hope for their families?
It's really interesting because you could say the illusion was gradually degrading over the years. There was in mid 1944, a brand new contingent of young women show up, and they're from Hungary or the Hungarian territories. So these are girls and young women that were taken first to Auschwitz, shaved, you know, um, given flimsy clothing that didn't fit, told their families were immediately killed. And then they show up out of the blue at these camps, and they communicate what's going on in Auschwitz. And so these girls suddenly realize what some of the things that are going on, but they're like, well, wait, is this just one place? Is this just the Hungarians? There's a great quote by one survivor that said, I knew, but I didn't know. I believed, but because they needed to tell themselves their families were alive to sustain themselves. Otherwise, they would collapse into despair. So almost all of them returned to their homes to see if any family was alive after liberation.
Thank you. And you also mentioned that some women were married, and I'm assuming the other ones that you didn't mention also perhaps had families as well. But were you able to follow up with any of their families to kind of research the effect that their experiences had on their children? Was that a part of your research at all, or?
Yes and no.
Mhm.
I decided, so I had a decision to make. I could do my own interviews and I did two of my own. Well, one was very brief, but I did a long one with Faye B. Um, so I realized that I wanted to use the existing testimonies so that people who wanted to go back and check, or people who wanted to do additional research, could build on it, that it was there. It wasn't just my personal interview. Um, and so I decided pretty early on that I was just going to stick with the testimonies that were in this archive. However, I did talk, because of their ages, a lot of them are, 99, 100, they're still alive. Rosalie Steinweiss is still alive. I talked to her. Um, Secondly, I did not really incorporate a psychological approach to trauma. I did interpret the traumatic moments in the testimony, but I did not seek to trace out the long-term impact beyond what they said in their testimony. Because I was really focused on because I feel that people don't maybe know too much about this part of, Germany and Poland and this part of the Holocaust, and I really wanted to document it, and I wanted to position them as creators of knowledge and how they analyze their situation. Um, I do think that I'll speak for myself. I have a tendency, I want to hear good news. I want to hear they overcame. I want to hear they started new families and they put it behind them. But um, I don't think that's the case. I think that they're aware we want to hear that, but that this is something, the early separation of their families. These were girls who, although they were very, kind of independent because they were already taking care of their siblings. They were 14, 15. They hadn't left home. They didn't go by themselves anywhere. This was a very conservative, period of time in Poland. So they had not lived apart from their parents.
Mhm.
So it was a very, very difficult for them. And I don't know that they really almost, I wouldn't say all, but many begin to lose their composure when they talk about their parents.
Okay, so I'm going to read this question just kind of as it came in. So, it is unlikely that in the early 40s, such isolated European girls would know about the American actress Marilyn Monroe, who would not become popular until a decade later. Do you think Rose, in her testimony given in 1996, was projecting or maybe inserting this a bit?
Oh, absolutely. And I also think she was very aware of the testimony process. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that, people are invited to give testimony. It's nerve-wracking. Public speaking is nerve-wracking. And here are people who they're not professional public speakers. They're being asked to talk, in front of a camera. And so they prepare. So they prepare what they're going to say. And absolutely, I'm sure she inserted that as she's trying to help, I think, the um, the listeners, feel what she was feeling about Mala Sternberg. And she, used Perry Como and Marilyn Monroe. She's trying to if you listen to the recording, she's trying to get a reaction from the interviewer. You're like, you have to remember this girl. You have to imagine her. So yeah, and that is nowadays most writers and historians that use testimony take that into account. That is there's all kinds of things that is inserted in testimony, and some of that is just because people are trying to make their testimony better. Like they're kind of aware of that. Yeah.
Thank you. So kind of maybe a more straightforward question than we had was you said that 15 was the age that girls were supposed to be taken. It was supposed to be 15 and above. Of course, that wasn't always the case, but can you talk about why 15 was the kind of age? It seems a little bit arbitrary. Um,
I don't know. But I want to talk about something related to that if I could.
yeah, of course.
I don't know. I think it was just a decision, there was a certain just decision made about the age. Some of it, I think, had to do with the factory owners.
Mhm.
Okay, so these are factories from the century before. Think about sweatshops and child labor. So these are factories that were using children like from the 1800s. So they don't think that, of course, in the period of the 20s and 30s, there's a lot of labor legislation around child labor, but there isn't a kind of understanding that, someone's too young to do textile work or whatever. And in fact, one of the testimony givers says that she was working alongside a German woman who had been working at that factory, like her basically since, from a very young age. But I don't know the German thinking, the perpetrator, German thinking behind it. I will say there is a part of the book in which some of the girls and women went in place of their sisters. So they were younger, but the older sister was considered um, not capable, or they were afraid she wouldn't survive harsh forced labor. And the younger one was more like a tomboy, or I can do it, and would say the birth date or say the name of the sister and go in her place. So the ages, we have ages, but it was always flexible. And also in the holding camp, the transit camp where you first went before, when the Jewish Council called you to report for forced labor, but before you were assigned to go to the Sudetenland or wherever, this was patrolled by the Jewish police. And sometimes the Jewish policemen would know your family and um, offer to switch you or accept a bribe, or there was all kinds of movement around age and who was going in and who was coming out of this forced labor situation in 41 and the first half of 42. By the middle of 42, there's a big shift in Zagwembe, and people start to realize that forced labor is actually a refuge from deportation to a harsher camp. So then they begin trying to get into forced labor, and they try to get their daughters, and you have very young daughters. You have Jewish police being bribed to take people, very young girls. I say very young. I mean, there's one incident of a 9-year-old, just somebody to go down there with the idea that the other girls and women would, somehow shelter them, not shelter them from work, but somehow help her out. And that was the case. So then, right, more people want to be in those camps.
Yeah. Thank you. So another question that we had that came in, and I don't know if you're kind of able to glean this from the testimony, but I will ask it. Did these girls and these women, did their perspectives on sort of what a Jewish future meant and their own future, did that change throughout their experience? And yeah, was that changed at all?
I would say, this is a big leap on my part because I'm interpreting, no, I think they were clutching onto it. I think if they had complained, there were only a couple that really said they had terrible childhoods. Almost all of them said, "Oh, my mother was perfect, my father was perfect," which I don't think they might have said all of them, prior if World War II hadn't happened, right? But they look back, they're in either because of the testimony situation or because of what they went through at the time. They're saying, I want that, what was there, what I had before I was sent to forced labor. And that is what a Jewish family is. And that is what I want. And that is what I want to go back to. And this desperation to go back to find, even, knowing kind of what had happened, being told the week of, May 94, so week of May, second week of May, they still insisted on going back. And they really did, to some extent, wanted that. Now, some of them, as I said, didn't, we don't have testimony from them who, married Gentiles after the war, but many of them kind of had this kind of crystallized, strong idea of wanting to recreate a Jewish future as soon as the war was over.
And you mentioned the women that married Gentiles after the war, and I know you said they didn't give testimony, but do you know at all if they were if this was frowned upon for them to marry a Gentile or if it was
Yeah,
accepted. Okay.
I think so. But the issue is, first of all, who was left of the family? Were the parents there? Was the extended family there? Were these women seeking to reintegrate into a European, a European Jewish community and that had been completely ruptured? Well, these women weren't. They just stayed in Troutnow. They stayed there where their Czech partners were. Um, was that because they knew their parents had been killed? Was that because they had fallen in love? Was that because wartime, opens up all kinds of possibilities that you would never consider if you were back in your home, community? So I don't know. There are scholars who've written about Jewish survivors who stay near where they were persecuted, which is an interesting phenomenon too.
We also have some questions that are wondering just kind of more about your research process for this book. So could you just kind of tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah. So I did not start out doing this. I thought I was going to do a study of Gross Rosen, the big camp, this big horrible camp that was both a death camp and a quarry and very brutal. And I went there. I went to their archives. And as a preliminary, so usually as a historian, you might do a preliminary visit to the archives to try to understand what is there. And I went on a preliminary trip, and I was the only one there. And I got to know the archivist just a little bit. And right near the end, she brought me these files called parshnits. And I had never heard of parshnits before. Now I think people have heard a little bit about it, but at the time, and this was in 2015, I had not heard at all about it. And I looked through, and these were witness depositions. They were made in the 1960s and 70s. So in the 60s and 70s, prosecutors in Germany decided to revisit some Nazi crimes, some war crimes that they hadn't been prosecuted right after the war. So they went in search of survivors, and they asked them if they had witnessed any war crimes and the names of guards and all of that. So this was an initiative. And so these were answers to those questions. And so they were very legal. And I'm stressing that because I want to say they were very legal. So they didn't give any picture of any of the things I said today, like there was nothing like Marilyn Monroe or whatever. It was just, but I did get a picture. They said we were only females, and I saw their dates of birth. And they said there were no gas chambers, there was no prison, there was no execution. And they got to wear their own clothes, and they still wanted to say it was terrible, and they wanted to say what was awful about it. And I was very interested, and I thought, I'm just going to go back to the Holocaust Museum in the US, and I'm going to see if there's testimonies from this Parshnitz. And I discovered, there were 300 or 250 of these testimonies, and I started to listen to them, and they were so fascinating that I pivoted, and I spent actually spent quite a bit of time just listening to testimonies, because I could not, some of the things they were saying did not fit with what we know about the Holocaust or the dominant narrative of the Holocaust, like wearing your own clothes, and that I felt I needed to know more. And I went to Troutnow, and I went to the archives of the factories and the local city archives. And I went to London, and I went to Berlin, um, to find, documentation of some of the things they were saying, because there were other things, like you could ask, like if you were in Bernsdorf, you could say, "Can I be transferred to be by my sister in Parshnitz?" And somebody would, and the guard would say, "Sure." They would just take. It was just unusual, that kind
Yeah.
of thing, for sure. Yeah.
And how long did the whole process take of kind of research and writing?
Well, my answer is the answer you can absolutely guess, which is the pandemic appeared and all the archives were shut down, and I couldn't listen to any testimonies. I was able to listen to some at another university that I figured out how to listen to the archives at that university virtually.
Mhm.
Um, and but I listened to each one at, 4 or 5 times. Like I just, the book took shape and I realized some of the themes, the themes of, that I was talking about of futurity, there were themes of the ethics of care, caring for one another. There was sexual violence at liberation. Um, I re-listened and re-listened to make sure I was really understanding how that testimony giver really saw things. So it took my first preliminary trip was in 2015 and the book came out in 2023. So
Wow, that's
it
amazing.
was long, yeah.
And so you mentioned that, because of the pandemic, you were not able to kind of view a lot of the testimonies. So if our viewers wanted to view any of the testimonies that you talked about, is there a specific place they have to go to do so?
Yes. So these testimonies are held by a place called the Visual History Archive, VHA. It's at USC in California. It was started by Steven Spielberg after he made Schindler's List. Um, they have several that are available on their website that they've handpicked. Um, there are also some in which the family has said it's okay for anyone to listen to this. However, most you cannot, because they don't want, I'm assuming they don't want people to clip and edit and use for purposes to deny the Holocaust and things like that. So you would have to listen at an institution that has access. And there are many of those. There's a map of those on the website of the VHA. And one of those is the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., which is where I listen to most of them.
Thank you. And we are coming to the end of our time, so I apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions, but thank you so much for sending them in. But I do want to end with kind of one final question, which is, this is a story that I'm assuming most of us haven't really heard before. So what is maybe one thing you hope that people take away from reading the book and from your presentation today?
I hope people begin to look at girls and women
Mhm.
as having their own, so we are working with what we've been given, a very gendered environment, and they are creating, and this is a situation in which they created avenues for survival. They created strategies. They created imagined futures for themselves. Um, and so testimony isn't just, oh, let's listen to this moving thing, this person's trauma, or let's listen to whether this person is right about how many chimneys were at Auschwitz. Testimony is an act of knowledge, creation, and an act of creativity, and it's an act of courage, as I said, for a person in their 60s or 70s to be filmed at that time. I mean, it's very difficult. And so I feel that these testimonies are very multidimensional, and I encourage people to either listen, or if there's somebody in your life who, just please record their story. I mean, I think that it's all invaluable.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Holc, for being with us today and for sharing these stories and for all the work that you've done to bring these stories into the forefront. It really means a lot. And I also want to thank everybody who joined us out in the internet verse. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mghnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mghnyc.org/current events. You can watch past programs and view and share today's recording. So the event was recorded, which will be available later this week or early next week on the museum's YouTube channel. Dr. Holc, thank you again. This was such a pleasure. Thank you to everyone. Have a great night, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank
Bye.
you.